So Abby and I were both inspired for today's message by a sermon preached from this pulpit last year. The topic was forgiveness, and the message was a classic one. If you want to live a good life, you must forgive people for their trespasses. In our society, we talk about forgiveness as if it is mandatory. The suggestion here is that only the most irrational of us would dare to withhold forgiveness. As the adult child of abusive parents, I know this just isn't right. While I don't harbor any ill will towards my parents, I do not forgive them for the harm that they caused me. As a Unitarian Universalist, I have a commitment to justice. And what I have observed on my own journey is that this idea of needing to forgive those who have caused us harm is often weaponized to further disenfranchise those who are most in need of love and understanding in our society. I believe the idea that forgiveness is mandatory really starts to come apart when we focus our attention not on petty disagreements, but on folks who have experienced serious moral wrongs, like child abuse and genocide. For today's message, I invite you to turn toward these kind of situations and consider our perspective with these vulnerable folks in your hearts. We're going to explore several reasons that people argue that forgiveness really is necessary. Abby is going to take us through the idea that forgiveness has physiological benefits, as well as the relationship between forgiveness, ableism, and the concept of victim blaming. I'm going to explore the ideas that forgiving is good because it makes us release our anger and avoid becoming bitter. While it is likely that Abby and I will say challenging things, it is important to know that our intention here is not to take forgiveness away from anyone who it serves. If forgiveness is helpful to you, then that is wonderful. Our goal here is to raise awareness that forgiveness is not necessarily helpful to everyone. And as Unitarian Universalists who aim to center love in all that we do, it is important that we remember that what might work for one person won't necessarily work for all. We have a large awareness of this when it comes to religious practices, but it extends beyond the deities or not deities that we worship and into ordinary concepts like forgiveness.
There is a commonly made claim that forgiveness has physiological benefits for the forgiver. That although the person who did us harm may not deserve forgiveness, refusing to forgive is ultimately a disservice to ourselves, because doing so carries negative consequences for our mental and physical health. In fact, there are a great number of articles citing studies to support this claim. Forgiveness. Your health depends on it. Whoa. Big if true. This is problematic for several reasons. First, we should always view pop science articles with an eye of skepticism. Quite often, the juicy-sounding headline represents a vast oversimplification of the study being reported. Even digging deeper into the bodies of the articles, we usually miss out on details that would provide a more complete picture of researchers' findings, because the authors have cherry-picked the most sensational excerpts and left out much of the nuance. The good news is, I was able to find a really boring meta-analysis written by Thomas W. Baskin and Robert D. Enright of 9 studies on forgiveness. The in-depth paper points out some of the details missed by the articles, as well as a few possible flaws in the research. To understand these findings, we need to understand 2 different ways someone can engage in forgiveness. The first involves making the decision to forgive someone. This is called decision-based forgiveness. The second one may or may not involve actually deciding to forgive someone, but most importantly involves a long personal development journey. This is called process-based forgiveness. The authors describe this journey from resentment and anger to the struggles to love and feel compassion toward a person who is difficult to love. This turns out to be a pretty important distinction because the decision-based forgiveness studies did not show effectiveness, while the process-based studies showed some benefit but were flawed. Even if we make the decision to forgive, we still have some work to do to release the burden of stress we feel. The process-based studies relied upon formal, long-term group or individual therapy. The authors of the paper point out that the duration of these therapies had a significant effect on patient outcomes, with longer treatment plans correlating to better results. This makes sense. The longer we work on anything, the better we generally are at it. So, as much as we would all love to declare, I release this stress, and have those pent-up feelings instantly leave our minds and bodies for good, we know it isn't actually that simple. The act of releasing the emotions that cause our bodies stress, anger, resentment, bitterness, hurt, etc., is in fact a continual journey of conscious and intentional inner work. And yes, I do mean work. If we are to understand forgiveness as a release of certain negative emotions that we hold, we should recognize the emotional labor that it requires and realize that doing that labor should be a choice for each individual, not an expectation. Of course, there is a mountain of evidence that reducing stress generally does wonders for the body, but we cannot know that practicing forgiveness was the only factor that led to decreased stress. Perhaps it was the simple act of talking to another impartial person about the problem that produced this benefit. Controlling for the many variables that can impact a person's mental state is extremely difficult. The study of humans is messy business. Surely, there are times when we ruminate on a resentment that festers and hardens into a proper grudge, and feeding that grudge could take a mental toll that becomes disruptive to our lives. In such cases, it is reasonable to consider whether practicing some form of stress relief could help us lighten the mental burden we carry. But is it the simple act of forgiving that allows us to melt this stress away? Probably not. On the other hand, learning how to manage our stress can help us temper our acute emotional response to what remains a righteous conviction. And now, left my script up here, so I didn't know it was my turn again. Okay. There are two big challenges to forgiveness when it comes to the impact it has on the victims of the harms perpetrated. One is related to ableism, and the other is victim blaming. We can see how this plays out when we critically examine the claim that forgiveness is good for your physical health. This came up in the sermon that inspired this message. The speaker said that people who refuse to forgive are not as conscious of the toxic health consequences of being unforgiving. This suggests that we know why these folks have health problems, and it is because they are choosing to withhold forgiveness. However, this is ableist. People who are ill may be so for a wide variety of reasons, suggesting that we can pinpoint the reason to a single interpersonal choice is saying that folks who are ill are choosing to be so. There are many reasons someone might be ill. How can we isolate forgiveness as the one and only factor in any given health outcome? Genetics, environment, lifestyle, injury, and a variety of internal and external stressors may play a role. This has the additional negative consequence of being victim blaming. By saying it's the fault of the ill person, we are saying they have brought this upon themselves. Even if this person could relieve their suffering through forgiveness, The fact that they suffer now is not solely their fault. The reason this situation has even arisen in the first place is because someone caused them harm. The perpetrator of the harm is also responsible, so simply blaming the person who already had to endure the original harm is victim blaming.
This is from John Kekes' 2009 article, Blame versus Forgiveness. It is obscene to tell survivors of the Gulag Nazi death camps, the torture chambers of Polpik ethnic cleansing, or the massacres in Rwanda or the Congo that they should avoid partisan grievance-oriented remembering.
In the reading we just heard, we see John Kekes taking a strong stand that is obscene to suggest to people who have endured some of the world's greatest harms that they should forgive and forget. Now, one reason you might think these individuals should forgive is that holding on to the idea that they have been harmed will make them angry, and this anger will hurt them. However, many philosophers argue that anger is sometimes both rational and appropriate to hold on to. And we may be causing ourselves harm by giving it up. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle points out that individuals who are deficient in appropriate anger are likely to be causing themselves significant problems. Sometimes we are rationally required to be angry, especially in cases where there is a significant power imbalance between the person causing harm and the person being harmed. When we give up that rational anger, Aristotle thinks we are experiencing problems with our self-worth. We are, quote, unlikely to defend ourselves, and we are more likely to, quote, endure being insulted. Aristotle goes so far as to suggest that a person giving up rational anger is a fool. Immanuel Kant is on the same page as Aristotle in this case. He says, quote, a person who fails to become angry at injustices done to him lacks dignity and self-respect. David Hume is also on a similar page as he points out that anger is, quote, inherent in our very frame and constitution, so the lack of such a feeling is sometimes evidence of weakness. So if forgiveness is necessary because it helps us let go of anger, we have to ask ourselves whether it is good to let go of anger in the first place. There may be times where the release of anger is appropriate, but when that anger is rationally justified and the release of it may lead us to cause more harm than good, then we may not want nor be required to forgive. Another challenge for the idea that forgiveness is good because it leads to the release of anger is that we can sometimes forgive someone and still be angry at them. This goes back to the decision-based forgiveness Abby mentioned earlier. If all that's accomplished when you forgive someone is you state the words, I forgive you, then nothing may change for you emotionally. This means that the project of releasing anger may in fact be totally separate from the project of forgiveness. So the idea that we should forgive because it will stop our anger starts to fall apart. It may be true that for some people, forgiving leads to the release of anger. But whether that is true or not will depend a lot on the individual and their emotional makeup. Now, let's turn to whether forgiveness is good because it helps us avoid becoming bitter.
The label bitterness is used politically to dismiss disadvantaged members of society, functioning to shift the focus away from unjust social and political circumstances toward individuals' supposedly pathological emotional state. From Dr. Katie Stockdale's Hope Under Oppression.
As Unitarian Universalists, we have a commitment to justice. And that commitment entails noticing how certain ideas are used to cause harm to those who are most vulnerable in our society. While it's hard to claim that being bitter is a wonderful thing, it is important to get really curious about the details whenever we value something like forgiveness, because it helps us avoid bitterness. So let's suppose that by failing to forgive my abusive parents, I have become bitter. Is that a bad thing? In Dr. Katie Stockdale's book, Hope Under Oppression, she argues that while bitterness may have some negative characteristics, it is actually an emotion that serves an important role in society. Bitterness is good because it draws attention to past and ongoing injustices that have yet to be resolved. Bitterness serves as a reminder that something bad has happened and collectively it still needs to be addressed. If Stockdale is right, the idea of forgiveness is good because it helps you avoid becoming bitter, starts to come apart. Bitter people make it more difficult for the powerful to deny past and ongoing wrongdoings. Bitter people make those who are responsible for those harms uncomfortable. At least in some cases, promoting the idea that you should forgive because it helps you avoid becoming bitter is nothing more than another way to say you should stay silent so the powerful can continue their business unbothered by justice. When I hear people say, you must forgive the people who harmed you, I hurt for all of the children of abusive parents. I hurt for my Jewish ancestors who perished in the Holocaust. I hurt for the Palestinian children perishing right now in the Gaza Strip. I do not have to forgive my parents. My ancestors do not have to forgive the Nazis, and the Palestinians do not have to forgive the actions of Netanyahu's Israel. These are real human experiences that deserve to be seen and not shamed into being something else. Now we're going to do the offering.
So now during this offering, please give what you will for the church that has meant so much to you, for the church that has meant so much to those who came before you, and for the church that will mean so much to people you will never know. Give what you will, for you are a generous people. On the television screens over here and on your computer screens over Zoom, you will see a QR code that can be used to submit donations electronically. Greeters will also pass by to collect physical donations from those present here today.
Well, I won't back down. No, I won't back down. You can stand me up at the gates of hell, but I won't back down. No, I won't stand back down. Let me turned around, and I'll keep this world from dragging.
If you seek forgiveness when people have harmed you, then I am happy for you. Forgiveness is very important for some folks and their journey to living their best lives. And for some folks, it isn't. Both these things can be true at the same time. And we can all make the world a little bit better by holding space for this nuance. And remember, If you didn't like the sermon, feel free to forgive us.